I probably should have just tossed that letter in the trash, but instead, I found myself with a 7-day deadline to tear down a fence on my own property. Yeah, let that sink in. The moment Vera Vance came strutting up my driveway like she personally owned every square inch of the county, I knew something was off. You ever had one of those neighbors? The kind who treats the HOA rulebook like gospel, but sees no problem trampling over basic human decency. What started as a petty dispute over a fence spiraled into something so absurd, I ended up auctioning off the land right beneath her house. If your HOAS ever pulled some outrageous stunt, go ahead and drop your story in the comments. Up until 6 months ago, I honestly thought I was living the good life, quiet, steady, with nothing more on my plate than my landscaping business and training horses out back. My property's tucked away at the dead end of Maple Grove Lane, a once humble neighborhood that's now bloated with overzealous homeowners and lawn measuring tape. I've got 5 acres, which around here might as well make me the town rancher, and you better believe people love to gossip about what I'm doing with all that land. Most days I just keep my head down, work with my horses, and let the rest of them obsess over their uniform hedges and soulless mailboxes. But deep down, I should have known that kind of peace couldn't last, not with Vera lurking. There was always something unsettling about how she eyed my fence, like she was picturing it gone. Then, one Tuesday morning in March, she showed up like a storm in heels, and I could tell from halfway down the drive this wasn't going to be neighborly. Vera's in her mid-50s, retired from some high-ranking banking job, but still walks and talks like she's closing deals and crushing dreams. She drives a spotless white Lexus, polished like it's afraid of dust, and she wore this power blazer that practically yelled, "Let me speak to your manager," before she even said a word. I was elbow deep in repairing a chunk of my old stone fence when I spotted her approaching with a clipboard clutched like a weapon. Never a good sign when someone marches up your driveway with that kind of purpose. And honestly, I don't even know why I didn't just duck inside and pretend I wasn't home, but something about Vera Vance's bulldozer-like determination told me she wasn't leaving until she delivered whatever grand declaration she had rehearsed in the mirror that morning. Looking back, that was the moment I should have known my peaceful, steady little life was about to be flipped upside down. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, like she was convening a board meeting, her voice clipped and authoritative before she was even within arm's reach. "I'm Vera Vance, president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, and we need to discuss your fence site too." The way she said fence situation made it sound like a biological hazard or a scandalous zoning violation, not a handmade fieldstone fence I'd carefully built myself over several weekends, about 4 feet high, perfectly aligned along the road's edge and easily one of the things I was proudest of on the property. I stood up, dusted off my gloves, and gave her a long look, this woman who decided that my hard work was now somehow her official concern. But judging by the way she stared at the stones like they were radioactive waste, you'd think I'd slapped together a wall out of rusted hubcaps and scrap lumber. "That ugly rock wall," she said, waving dramatically like she was directing traffic, "completely ruins the look of our beautiful neighborhood. It makes the whole street feel like some abandoned old farm." She went on to say the HOA board had received multiple complaints about how the fence was destroying the aesthetic continuity of the community. For a second, I genuinely thought she was messing with me. I blinked, searched her face for a hint of sarcasm. Nothing. Not a twitch. Just steely-eyed conviction and a death grip on that clipboard, like she was about to deliver a cease and desist order for crimes against suburban uniformity. "Aesthetic continuity," she said, like we were living in some gated architectural masterpiece. Instead of a neighborhood where half the houses have faded garden gnomes, plastic flamingos, and dollar store pinwheels spinning in the breeze. But no, Vera was dead serious. standing there like she'd just discovered a national emergency in my front yard. I crossed my arms and held my ground, sensing this conversation was about to veer into something far more serious than just a squabble over landscaping, and judging by the way Vera kept glancing at her notes like she was reading from a legal script, it was clear this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment neighborly chat. She'd prepared for this confrontation down to the syllable. "The board has voted," she declared with the kind of theatrical authority you'd expect from a federal judge. "And we're giving you 7 days to voluntarily remove this eyesore." Her voice dripped with superiority, like she was doing me some grand favor, and when I asked what would happen if I didn't comply, her professional smile twisted into something colder, something predatory. "The HOA," she said, as casually as if she were discussing garbage pickup, "has full legal authority to force the auction of non-compliant properties, Mr. Thorne. We'd prefer not to go that route, but we will protect our community's property values by any means necessary." I stared at her, trying to process what I'd just heard. Did she really just threaten to auction off my land over a handmade stone fence? On property I'd owned and maintained for years? I was so stunned I didn't even respond at first. Just stood there wondering if I'd accidentally stumbled into some dystopian suburban twilight zone where HOA presidents got to play judge, jury, and executioner. Part of me wanted to challenge her right then and there, demand to see the bylaws that gave her such power, but something about the way she said it made me hesitate. Either she was bluffing with Oscar-level confidence, or she'd actually pulled this stunt before. And judging by the smug glint in her eyes, my gut told me this wasn't her first rodeo. I couldn't help but wonder how many of my neighbors had been intimidated into submission by this same routine, how many had folded before the ink dried on whatever notice she shoved in their mailboxes. So I stayed quiet, arms still crossed, listening to her go on about fiduciary duties, legal precedent, and community preservation. All while thinking, lady, you just stepped in it deeper than you realize. She kept talking for another 5 minutes, her voice full of authority, but my mind was already racing with suspicion, because someone that confident about stealing a man's land over a fence probably wasn't bluffing, and that meant there was a much bigger game being played here than I'd first thought. Over the years, maybe others had gotten the full Vernon's treatment, steamrolled by her faux authority and passive-aggressive charm. And while I might have been reading too much into it, something about our entire exchange felt off from the very first moment, especially the way she suddenly broke eye contact when I asked about past enforcement actions. That subtle flicker of discomfort told me this wasn't her first crusade, and there was likely more going on than a simple issue with my fence. When Vera finally finished her HOA sermon, she handed me an official-looking document, the kind printed on crisp paper with a bold header and a big red circle around the deadline. 7 days. "I hope you'll make the right decision for everyone involved," she said, in that fake sweet tone of someone who just dropped a lit match on your porch. As she turned and strutted back toward that spotless Lexus, I watched her go, feeling the weight of that letter in my hand and the tension still buzzing in the air. And I couldn't help but think this woman's been playing judge and executioner for far too long. Then I looked from the letter to my perfectly crafted stone fence, and for the first time all day, a slow grin began to tug at the corners of my mouth. "Are you absolutely sure everything the HOA has built is completely legal?" I called out loud and clear. She stopped cold, mid-stride, her shoulders stiffening. For just a second, her mask-slipped surprise flickered across her face before she quickly reset into that frosty, unbothered glare and climbed into her car without saying a word. I stood there watching her drive off, and all I could think was, I'm either about to cave to this madness or dig up something a lot messier than she's prepared for, because my gut told me this fence wasn't the real issue, just the first thread in a much larger unraveling. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table, rereading Vera's ultimatum while a quiet storm built in my chest. 7 days to demolish something I built on land I own or face a forced auction. That seemed like a hell of a lot of authority for a volunteer HOA to claim, especially considering I wasn't even sure I was part of it. My property sits at the very end of the street, just far enough that I'd always wondered where their jurisdiction really stopped. I'd never signed a thing, never attended a meeting, never even received HOA newsletters until this stunt. But what if they'd slipped something in years ago, hidden in fine print I never read? I stared at the letter again, my unease growing, and realized one thing with absolute clarity: I needed answers, and fast. I'm not usually the type to go digging through paperwork or old records, but this time, something told me I'd better start. I'm not usually the type to dig through paperwork or chase down legal loopholes, but something about Vera's smug, untouchable attitude rubbed me so hard in the wrong direction that I couldn't let it go. She'd been so composed, so certain of her authority, like she'd steamrolled dozens of people before me and never once been questioned. That kind of confidence doesn't come from bluffing. It comes from never being challenged. And the more I thought about it, the more I wondered how many other folks on this street had quietly caved to her threats, without ever checking whether she actually had the legal right to do what she was doing. I kept replaying her expression. When I asked if everything the HOA built was strictly above board, and that hesitation barely a second screamed that there was something buried under all that smugness. So I pulled out every document I had from when I bought the place: the deed, the title, the insurance records, and most importantly, the original property survey. I'm no lawyer, but I've done enough work with land and measurements to read a survey without getting lost in the jargon. And when I laid it out and started tracing the boundary lines, my stomach dropped. Turns out my property didn't stop. Where the neighborhood sidewalk ended, like I'd always assumed, I'd extended farther, right into the so-called common area of the HOA, that strip of land at the front of the neighborhood. The one with the big fancy Maple Grove welcome sign, carefully trimmed landscaping, and the shiny new security cameras. That entire stretch of curated suburbia sat directly on my land. Every shrub, spotlight, and polished stone? Mine. I stared at that paper, stunned, thinking I must have read it wrong. Measured it twice, then a third time. And finally, I sat back and let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. For 8 years, while I'd been minding my business, quietly training horses and fixing fences, the HOA had been squatting on my property like they owned it, never asked permission, never paid a cent, and now here they were, threatening to auction off my home over a fieldstone fence I built with my own hands, completely legal and well within my boundary. The irony was so thick, you could spread it on toast. Vera, who'd marched up to my door preaching about community standards and visual harmony, had been trespassing building on my land the entire time. And the craziest part? I wasn't even furious yet. Just impressed. Staggered, really, by the pure audacity. This woman had been lecturing me on property lines while decorating mine like it was part of her personal kingdom. That was the moment. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the edge of my property, determined to see with my own eyes just how deep this mess really went, and what I found left no room for doubt. The HOA's entrance display was, I'll admit, impressive. A massive, custom-cut stone sign boldly declaring Maple Grove Estates, flanked by neat rows of professionally planted seasonal flowers, decorative lighting that cast a warm glow. Across the whole setup, and a pair of sleek security cameras trained on the main road like silent sentinels. It looked like a high-end development ad straight out of a brochure. Probably cost them somewhere in the ballpark of 15 to 20. Grand to put together, and it all sat 15 feet into my land. Not inches. Not a couple of feet. 15. That's not a minor oversight or a surveying hiccup. That's straight-up occupation. I stood there in the dark, my flashlight beam sweeping across polished stone and manicured shrubs, and suddenly, those spotlights didn't feel so decorative anymore, especially once I realized they were tapped into my electrical grid. I could practically hear my meter spinning every time that sign lit up. As I stood in the glow of their self-congratulatory monument, I started to feel a deep, slow burn rising in my chest. How many others had Vera pushed around over the years? Drowning them in official-looking letters and empty legal threats? Had she built her little suburban empire on bluffing people into submission while casually trespassing on their land? Maybe I was reading too much into it, or maybe I just uncovered the ugly foundation of her power trip. Either way, I wasn't. About to be the next name she crossed off her list. Not a chance. Still, I didn't storm back to the house and call her on the spot. No, I wanted her to keep thinking she had the upper hand while I laid the groundwork to make this whole thing airtight. If Vera wanted to play real estate chess, I was going to make sure every piece on my board was exactly where it needed to be before I made my move. I wanted everything documented officially and indisputably before I showed my hand. And that meant it was time to bring in a professional. First thing the next morning, I called a licensed surveyor, not the one who did the original work years ago, but someone neutral, with no ties to anyone in Maple Grove, and asked them to confirm every inch of my boundary lines. While I waited, I started snapping photos of everything. The sign, the landscaping, the lighting, even the camera mounts. I wanted every detail preserved, every possible angle covered, because something told me Vera was about to find herself on the wrong end of the property line for the first time in a very long time. The sign, the carefully manicured landscaping, the security cameras, all of it sat neatly on land that legally belonged to me. And while part of me wondered if I was being petty for caring this much, that fleeting guilt vanished the second I remembered Vera's threat to auction off my home like it was some foreclosed fixer-upper. She'd been the one to open this can of worms with her smug 7-day ultimatum and her sanctimonious talk about preserving property values by any means necessary. Well, now she was about to learn what protecting property really looked like when you went toe-to-toe with someone who actually knew their rights and wasn't afraid to dig in. I started logging everything, every veiled threat, every passive-aggressive warning, every ridiculous claim she'd made about the H.O.A.'s authority, because if this thing went legal, I wanted a paper trail that painted the full picture. That night, I sat back at my kitchen table, documents spread out like a battle map, and felt a slow, satisfied grin creep across my face. You want to play property games, Vera? Fine, game on. But as I traced those boundary lines again and thought about what this accidental discovery might really mean, a deeper, more unsettling question started to gnaw at me. If the H.O.A. had been this careless, this brazen with my property, what else had they done under the radar? How many other rules had they bent, overlooked, or just outright ignored while building their little H.O.A. empire? What if this wasn't a one-time screw-up, but the beginning of something much bigger, something systemic? I wasn't sure I was ready for what else I might find, but one thing was certain. Vera's deadline was starting to feel less like a threat and more like the countdown to her reckoning. And right on cue, just 4 days later, she fired the first official shot across the bow. A certified letter, sealed and stamped like it came from the IRS, waiting smugly in my mailbox. It read like it had been drafted by a team of lawyers who charged by the 3 pages of bloated legalese that boiled down to the same tired demand: tear down your fence or risk forfeiting your property. But the real gem was attached to the back a notice for an emergency community meeting scheduled for that Saturday, apparently to discuss my ongoing property violations and how they were negatively impacting neighborhood standards. If Vera thought she was about to rally the community and shame me into submission, she was in for a surprise because I wasn't just armed with the survey anymore. I had the truth, the receipts, and a fire lit under me that she wasn't ready for. She was actually staging a public trial, an honest-to-God HOA courtroom spectacle with the neighbors acting as judge and jury, and I had to reread the letter twice just to believe what I was seeing. A full-blown community meeting over a 4-foot stone fence, like I'd committed some unspeakable suburban crime. Vera was out here turning a property dispute into a primetime drama, and while I was floored by the audacity, I had to give her credit for commitment. Her flair for theatrics was undeniable, even if her legal standing was flimsier than a plastic lawn chair in a hurricane. The fact that she was so sure of herself, so casually confident in organizing this little HOA inquisition, made me wonder just how many neighbors had quietly folded under the weight of her self-appointed authority over the years. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp at the community center, and the official notice worded it like I was a threat to national security, to address the non-compliant stone fence construction that violates established aesthetic guidelines and threatens property values throughout Maple Grove Estates. I read that line and laughed out loud. This woman was trying to paint my handcrafted stone fence as a menace to society while literally squatting on 15 feet of my land with her HOA monument. Either she had nerves of steel, or she was completely oblivious to the legal firestorm waiting for her, or maybe both. Part of me was tempted to march in with my survey, slam it down on the table, and watch the whole charade collapse on the spot. But the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to see just how far she was willing to go before reality slapped her in the face. So I waited. Saturday night came, and when I walked into the community center, I was surprised to find it packed easily. 20, maybe 25 neighbors all gathered like this was some kind of H.O.A. State of the Union. Vera had gone all out. A presentation area with a projector, printed photos of my fence displayed like crime scene evidence, even color-coded charts showing ALLEGED property value trends, and a full-blown PowerPoint about preserving community harmony. I slipped into a seat at the back, watching her move through the crowd like a politician on election night, smiling, shaking hands, making her rounds like she owned the place. Say what you will about Vera Vance, the woman knew how to hold room. What she didn't know, at least not yet, was that she was about to be the star of a much different story than the one she thought she was telling. She even had animations in her. PowerPoint, yes, animations, and I have expected the next slide to feature a graph blaming me for tanking Zillow estimates across the zip code. All of this drama, all this effort, for a 4-foot stone fence that wasn't bothering anyone except Vera and her obsessive need for control. But as I watched her meticulously orchestrated presentation unfold, I realized this spectacle had nothing to do with aesthetics or guidelines. It was about power, plain and simple. This was Vera's way of flexing, of asserting dominance over the neighborhood and sending a crystal clear message: fall in line or get steamrolled. When she finally called the meeting to order, her tone shifted from neighborhood president to courtroom prosecutor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice full of gravitas, "we're here tonight because one resident's refusal to follow community guidelines threatens everything we've worked to build in Maple Grove Estates." Then came the slideshow photo after photo of my fence, taken from every imaginable angle, some so exaggerated they made it look like a medieval fortress. "This unauthorized stone barrier," she said, as if I'd built a military checkpoint, "destroys the visual flow of our neighborhood and sets a dangerous precedent for other residents to ignore established standards." I honestly wasn't sure whether to be insulted or give her a slow clap for her dramatic rebranding of my weekend handiwork. She spoke for about 15 minutes, painting me as a rogue anarchist with a chisel, out to sabotage the entire Maple Grove aesthetic. She even had pre-written testimonials from a few carefully selected neighbors, all parroting concerns about property values and visual cohesion. A handful of them stood up during the meeting to voice their carefully rehearsed disapproval, repeating Vera's talking points like they were reading from a script. I stayed silent, watching the circus play out, letting her dig herself deeper with every exaggerated claim and fake regulation. Each slide she clicked through, each threat she rattled off about the HOA's supreme authority was just more ammo for me to use later. A few neighbors gave me quick, apologetic glances, clearly uncomfortable with how far this had gone, but most seemed hypnotized by Vera's performance until the moment of truth arrived. A neighbor from down the street, someone I'd spoken to only a handful of times, raised his hand and asked the question I'd been waiting for like a ticking clock. "Vera, are you absolutely certain the HOA has the legal authority to force property auctions?" And just like that, the room shifted. "That seems like an extreme measure for a fence dispute," the neighbor said, and right then, Vera launched into what she clearly thought was a mic drop moment. She straightened up, her voice brimming with smug authority as she declared, "Absolutely. The Maple Grove HOA has full legal authority to maintain community standards by whatever means necessary, including forced auctions of non-compliant properties. We've used this authority before, and we won't hesitate to use it again to protect our community's interests." And just like that, she handed me everything I needed. That sentence, those exact words, were the rope she looped around her own neck, and the best part was she had no clue. I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing right there in the middle of the room. She had just openly announced in front of 24 witnesses that she'd use the threat of forced auctions to push other residents out of their homes and fully intended to do the same to me all over a completely legal fence built on my own land. The way she tossed around legal jargon like confetti told me everything I needed to know about how she operated: intimidate, manipulate, and steamroll anyone who didn't fall in line. Meanwhile, I was in the back, quietly scribbling notes like a student in a courtroom drama. Every threat, every claim about the HOA's sweeping powers, every arrogant declaration about their enforcement history, Vera was unknowingly building my legal case line by line. And when the meeting finally started to wind down and the room began to empty, a few neighbors cautiously approached me, their expressions tight with concern. "Is it true they can actually auction off your house?" one asked. "Have they really done this to other people? What are you going to do?" I just gave a calm smile and told them, "We'll see how it plays out." But I could see it in their eyes, fear. If Vera could come after me with this much aggression over a fence, what could she do to them over a mailbox, a flower bed, or the wrong shade of shutters? After most of the crowd had cleared, Vera walked up to me with that same cold, practiced smile she'd worn when she first showed up at my fence. "I hope tonight helped clarify the situation for you, Harlan," she said smoothly. "This isn't personal, it's just business. But rules are rules, and we have a responsibility to enforce them." I looked her square in the eye and replied, "I completely agree, Vera. Rules are definitely rules, and everyone should be held to the same standard." Something about the way I said it made her hesitate, just for a second. Her expression faltered, like she was trying to figure out if there was a hidden meaning buried in my words. But then, she gave a short nod, turned, and walked away completely unaware of just how badly she'd underestimated me. Walked back up to the house, clipboards in hand and expressions set in that quiet, no-nonsense way professionals carry when they've just confirmed something big. I knew I hadn't been overreacting. Vera had strutted out of that meeting like she'd scored a win, probably thinking I'd slink off and quietly dismantle my fence before the deadline hit, but what I was actually doing was laying the groundwork for something much bigger. As I walked to my truck that night, I wondered if maybe I'd been too patient through all of this, or if I was setting the kind of trap that would make her wish she'd never picked this fight. And sure enough, bright and early Thursday morning, 2 days before her deadline, the cavalry arrived. Tom Peterson, founder of Peterson and Associates, pulled up right at 8 a.m. with his survey crew in tow. This wasn't just some guy with a measuring wheel and clipboard. Peterson's been surveying land in this county for over 30 years, and I'd hired him for exactly that reason. I wanted precision. I wanted credibility. I wanted someone with a reputation solid enough to silence even the loudest HOA president. The man's been settling property disputes since before GPS was even a thing, and when he stepped out with tripods, rangefinders, and gear that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie, I knew Vera's little kingdom was about to take a hit. I laid out everything: Vera's threats, the fence nonsense, the H.O.A.'s construction on my property, and Peterson just nodded, calm and steady. "Let's see what we're really dealing with here," he said, his voice cool and confident, like he'd seen this exact scenario play out 100 times. While I walked him through the timeline and showed him the key areas of concern, his crew fanned out with practiced precision, setting up their equipment and pulling up the original property markers buried years ago. For the next 3 hours, I watched as they worked with a level of focus that bordered on surgical. Every line was checked and rechecked, every angle confirmed with both GPS data and traditional methods, no room for error, no corner left ambiguous. They conferred over maps and digital readouts, adjusted equipment, made notes, and moved with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing exactly what you're doing. And when they finally came back up to the porch with their final results in hand, I could tell from the look on Peterson's face, Vera was in trouble. And she didn't even know it yet. Boundaries wrong. Could they have messed up ours too? And that's when I realized just how deep this mess really went. Tom Peterson's team hadn't just uncovered a boundary mistake, they'd exposed years of negligence, or worse, calculated overreach. Every inch of the HOA's precious entrance, the oversized stone sign, the curated flower beds, the lighting, even the security cameras aimed at the street, was sitting well within my property lines. Not a little. A lot. We're talking 12 to 15 feet of unauthorized construction that had quietly sat there for nearly a decade while Vera barked about aesthetics and compliance. When Tom showed me the survey results with color-coded diagrams, high-res images, and GPS coordinates, accurate to the inch, I knew this wasn't just leverage, it was dynamite. He handed me the folder like it was a court exhibit, and I could tell from his expression he was almost impressed by the scale of the screw-up. "In 30 years, he said, scanning the printouts one last time, "I've never seen a mistake like this stand uncorrected for so long. You've got one hell of a case here." And that's when the neighborhood really started buzzing. Word spread faster than wildfire, and by Thursday afternoon my phone was blowing up texts, voicemails, even knocks on my door. Some people were stunned, wanting to know if the rumors were true. Others sounded nervous, clearly wondering if this exposed something bigger about Vera's reign. "If they got your boundary wrong," one neighbor asked, "what if they did it to all of us?" The tone was changing. Vera's iron grip over Maple Grove was slipping, and now I had the proof in my hands. The woman who had threatened to auction off my home for a 4-foot fence had built her HOA empire on land that didn't even belong to her. And judging by the panicked whispers going around the neighborhood, I wasn't the only one wondering just how far her power grab had gone. She stared at the bright orange marker like it was a ticking time bomb, her confidence crumbling with every step we took. The landscaping she once bragged about, the lights she insisted were necessary for safety, even the security cameras she justified for community peace of mind. All of it was now irrefutable proof of her overreach. For the First time, Vera didn't have a comeback or a citation to throw in my face. She just stood there, silent, arms crossed tightly, watching the empire she'd built on intimidation and misused authority start to collapse under the weight of hard evidence. I kept my tone calm, professional, even generous, but I made it clear that this wasn't just about offense anymore. It was about 8 years of unauthorized use of my land. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to find a way out, but there was no HOA clause or fine that could erase the bright orange markers now dotting her pride and joy. As we walked back to the house, she finally muttered something about needing to consult with the board, but her voice lacked any of its usual weight. I nodded, told her that was probably a good idea, and reminded her that I had full documentation from Peterson and Associates ready to present in court, if necessary. The transformation in her was almost surreal, from a smug enforcer of imaginary rules to a visibly shaken bureaucrat grasping at straws. By the time she drove away, her SUV rolling past the very sign now confirmed to be planted illegally on my land, I knew the tide had fully turned. The neighborhood was no longer whispering, they were watching. And Vera, once so sure of her untouchable status, was now the one under scrutiny. Her empire had been built on bluster and boldness, but now under the harsh light of truth, it was all starting to unravel one survey stake at a time. "This is just a technicality," she said, but her voice trembled like a chandelier in an earthquake, her confidence unraveling by the second. "We can work something out, maybe pay you a small fee for the use of the land, make it all official and proper." The same woman who threatened to auction off my home just days ago was now fumbling for a rental agreement on land she'd effectively stolen for nearly a decade. I could practically see the math scrambling behind her eyes as she tried to estimate the cost of this mess: legal fees, back payments, public fallout, and that's when I decided it was time to lay my cards on the table. "Vera," I said, measured and composed, "just last week you were ready to kick me out of my home over a perfectly legal fence. Now I discover you've been encroaching on my property for 8 years. How do you think that looks?" She attempted damage control, mumbling about outdated plats and honest mistakes, but the truth was clear in her eyes. This wasn't some clerical oversight. It was years of unchecked arrogance. When she finally turned and walked back to her Lexus, shoulders hunched like she was dragging a piano uphill, I knew the power dynamic had shifted for good. The real question now wasn't whether I could keep my fence, it was what I planned to do about years of trespassing, electrical theft, and intimidation masked as HOA governance. Do I take the settlement and quietly move on, or do I make Vera and everyone like her finally learn what it means to respect a property line? That evening, as streetlights flickered to life, I sat down at my computer and typed the single, most satisfying email I've ever written. Thanks to Vera's own misguided attempt at transparency, the HOA's contact list was publicly available, and now every resident of Maple Grove Estates was about to receive a detailed, well-documented explanation of how their trusted HOA president had been operating her kingdom with all the legality of a pirate flag. It was time to show this neighborhood what real transparency looked like and expose who'd actually been hiding the truth all along. I crafted the email with care, giving it a subject line that was impossible to ignore: important property. Line information for all Maple Grove residents. I kept the tone professional, but didn't pull any punches, laying out exactly what the certified property survey had revealed, and how the HOA under Vera's leadership had been trespassing on my land for nearly a decade. I told myself this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, truth, and making sure the people of Maple Grove knew who was really protecting the neighborhood and who was abusing their authority. But let's be real, there was definitely a certain satisfaction in knowing Vera was about to choke on her own medicine. The email started with a summary of the fence dispute and the threats I'd received, then dove straight into the meat of the matter. The official survey results, photos of the markers, and detailed documentation of the HOA's unlawful construction pillars, cameras, signage, all sitting pretty on my property. But the real kicker? I added a section announcing my own upcoming property auction of the land beneath Vera's entrance sign, landscaping, and yes, even the ground her security cameras stood on. Since Mrs. Vant believes property auctions are an appropriate method for resolving neighborhood disputes, I wrote, I've decided to host one myself. The highest bidder will own the very land where these HOA features now stand. It was bold, a little provocative, but undeniably fair after all. I was just following her playbook. More than anything, I wanted the neighborhood to understand the irony. The same woman who'd threatened to take someone's house had been quietly squatting on their property for 8 years. It was a classic story of the bully getting humbled, but living through it had been anything but easy. I hit send at exactly 10 p.m. on Friday night and leaned back, heart pounding, eyes locked on my phone. The first call came in less than 5 minutes later, shouted before I could even say hello, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "You're trying to destroy everything we've built here," she cried, as though I was the villain in some melodramatic suburban soap opera. I let her vent for a moment, then calmly reminded her that I was simply following the precedent she had set. If forced property auctions were fair game, then surely she couldn't object to one more. That only made her angrier. "This is harassment," she snapped, completely ignoring the fact that she had launched this war over a 4-foot fence. But beneath her fury, I could hear the fear. She knew the tide had turned. Her credibility was unraveling, her authority slipping through her fingers with every neighbor who read that email or walked by and saw those bright orange survey markers in my yard. What she'd tried to pass off as community leadership was now being exposed as years of unchecked overreach and arrogance. I didn't need to raise my voice or make threats. I just told her the truth. "You picked this fight, Vera, and now you're going to see what happens when you try to bully the wrong neighbor." She hung up on me, but the damage was already done. The phone kept ringing all afternoon, this time with people not just sympathizing, but asking questions, probing deeper, wondering aloud how many other lines the HOA had crossed over the years. I knew I had changed the conversation. No longer was I the guy with a non-compliant fence. I was the neighbor who stood up, documented the truth, and put the self-appointed queen of Maple Grove on notice. And something told me this story was just getting started. She screamed into the phone, "This is harassment. This is extortion. I'll sue you for everything you're worth." I let her rant for a few minutes, calmly letting the storm pass before replying. "Vera, I'm simply following the precedent you set. You taught me how property auctions work. Remember? You said they were a perfectly reasonable way to handle community disputes." The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if she'd had a stroke. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all its usual edge. It was quieter, now almost pleading. "Harlan, please, we can work this out. My grandkids visit that house. It's not just bricks and mortar to me." For a second, just a second, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered her standing on my lawn, threatening to auction off my home like it was just another HOA infraction. That flicker of sympathy disappeared fast. This wasn't about revenge. It was about helping her truly understand what it felt like to have someone threaten everything you'd built with no warning and no remorse. By Sunday, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People were choosing sides, and Team Harlan was gaining serious traction as more and more stories emerged about Vera's heavy-handed leadership. The hypocrisy of her building on my land for 8 years, while trying to shame me over a legal fence wasn't sitting well with a lot of folks. Even some of her longtime supporters had begun to question whether she'd taken her authority too far. I spent most of the weekend fielding phone calls and doorstep visits. Some neighbors were worried about their own property boundaries, others were trying to understand the legal consequences for the HOA, and a few were just thrilled to see someone finally push back against Vera's reign of petty intimidation. The general consensus was clear. Vera had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom for far too long, and maybe, just maybe, it was finally time for a little accountability. By Sunday evening, I made it official. The auction would be held the following Saturday at 10 a.m. sharp at the Maple Grove Community Center. All are welcome, I wrote in the follow-up email. Might as well turn her drama into an open house. I kept the tone breezy, even playful, but the message was unmistakable. This was happening. And soon, when I hit send on that final email, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. On one hand, it felt like justice measured, undeniable justice was finally catching up to someone who'd wielded her position like a weapon for years. On the other, I was fully aware that I just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. By next weekend, I'd either be the neighborhood hero or the guy who went too far. I wasn't sure which. All I knew was that Vera had started this with her arrogance, her threats, and her complete disregard for fairness. Now, I planned to finish it in a way no one in Maple Grove would soon forget. Still, a small voice nagged at me. What if I just declared war on the whole neighborhood? Saturday morning came with the kind of crisp, electric October air that makes everything feel bigger than it is, like the world knows something important is about to happen. I got up early, too wired to sleep. This was it. I'd hired a professional auctioneer, Jim Morrison, not the rock star, obviously, who'd been handling estate sales and property disputes across the county for 2 decades. The man had a voice like gravel dipped in authority, and he brought his own sound system, podium, and printed flyers. Everything was done by the book. I wanted no technicalities, no loopholes. Just truth. Word had spread fast way beyond Maple Grove. I'd started getting calls from people as far as the next county, all curious about the so-called revenge auction. Apparently, suburban drama travels fast. A reporter from the local paper even reached out for a comment, but I declined. I figured the auction would speak for itself. By 9:45 a.m., the community center was packed wall to wall. Residents, onlookers, real estate investors, even a couple of curious city officials showed up, whispering among themselves. Some came to support me. Others came to see Vera get humbled. And a few just came for the spectacle. Who knew a dispute over a stone fence would become the biggest event in town? But as I stood there looking at the crowd, one thing was absolutely certain. No matter how this ended, today was going to change Maple Grove forever. And gentlemen, he said, his voice cutting clean through the tension like a blade. We're here today for a very unique and legally sanctioned event, the public auction of land currently in dispute between a private homeowner and the Maple Grove HOA. You could feel the entire room hold its breath as the word sank in. This wasn't a prank, a stunt, or a symbolic protest. This was real. I scanned the room again. Phones were out, recording, capturing every twitch and whisper like courtroom stenographers. People leaned in, eyes wide. Some neighbors wore smirks, others looked like they were witnessing the final moments of a long-running dictatorship. Vera sat still, jaw clenched, as Jim described the parcel, dimensions, GPS coordinates, documented encroachments. The land in question includes, but is not limited to, the ground beneath the HOA entrance sign, decorative landscaping, surveillance cameras, and 2 stone pillars, each estimated at approximately $5,000 in construction value. A few gasps. A few stunned murmurs. He raised a hand for silence. Bidding will begin shortly, with the starting price set at $1. A ripple of shocked laughter passed through the crowd, but I stayed quiet, standing near the back with folded arms and a calm expression I wasn't sure I actually felt. Vera's eyes never left me. I could see her mentally calculating how bad this could get, how much worse it already was. I didn't know if anyone would actually bid. The goal wasn't to sell the land, not really. It was to expose her, to force the truth into daylight where it couldn't hide behind HOA, bylaws, and committee meetings. Jim scanned the room. "Do." I hear $1. A hand went up, then another, and another. I heard someone whisper, "This is insane," and someone else reply, "This is justice." And at that moment, I knew, no matter how this ended, Vera's reign over Maple Grove was officially over. $70,000, the numbers climbed steadily, each bid like a nail in the coffin of Vera's reign. She sat frozen, staring at the floor, while the crowd she once controlled erupted into a spectacle she couldn't stop. Her silence now spoke louder than all the rules she'd enforced over the years. The auctioneer kept the pace measured, his voice steady and professional as he called out each offer. "75,000, do I hear 80? He said, scanning the room. One of the investors, a guy in a sharp navy suit with no ties to the neighborhood, nodded once. 80,000. A hush fell again as the realization sank in. Someone might actually buy the ground beneath. Vera's house. At $90,000, Jim paused. Going once. Going twice. Then, out of nowhere, $100,000, someone called from the back. Gasps. Murmurs. Even I turned, surprised. It was a young couple I didn't recognize, likely developers. At that moment, Vera finally stood again, this time trembling. "Please," she said, voice brittle but loud enough to reach the room. "Don't do this. I'll fix it. I'll make it right." I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but it was too late. People had heard the stories. They'd seen the emails. They knew this wasn't about a single mistake. It was about control, intimidation, and years of unchecked power. And now, Vera was paying the price. Not with fines, but with humiliation. Jim Morrison raised his gavel. 100,000 going once. Going twice. He paused, giving the room one last heartbeat to breathe. Sold. The gavel hit the podium with a satisfying finality that echoed through the room. And just like that, the land beneath. Vera Vance's house had a new owner, and Maple Grove had a new chapter. ChatGPT said, because it was never about the money. It was about making a point, and I'd made it. Every eye in the room was on me as I slowly stood up and walked to the front. Jim Morrison paused, clearly unsure of what to do next. "Sir, you already—" "I know," I said, cutting him off gently. "I'm not bidding to win. I'm bidding to end this." I turned to face the crowd, to face Vera, who looked like she couldn't breathe. "I'm purchasing the land rights back under my own name," I said, voice steady but clear. "Not to evict anyone, not to tear down anything, but to remind everyone what it feels like when power is abused, when threats become weapons, and when one person thinks they're above everyone else." People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension had shifted, but no one was laughing anymore. I looked directly at Vera. "You tried to auction off my house because of a fence that was fully legal. You bullied half this room into submission for years. You stole land and acted like it was yours. This was just a mirror." Her lips trembled. "So? What now?" "I'll be recording the land rights officially under my name," I said, "but I'm not forcing you out, not today. Instead, I'll draft a formal lease agreement, short-term, minimal cost, just enough to make it legal. You'll step down as HOA president, effective immediately." and you'll issue a public apology to every resident you've ever harassed." She blinked through tears, and for once, she said nothing. Just nodded. The room stayed quiet as I turned back toward the crowd. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about rebuilding trust, for all of us. A few people clapped. Others just sat there, stunned. But no one booed. No one jeered. Because for the first time in years, Maple Grove had something it hadn't seen in a long time, a leader who wasn't afraid to do the right thing, even when it hurt. And that was worth more than any winning bid. Neighbors came up to shake my hand. A few hugged me. One guy whispered, "You just saved this neighborhood from going nuclear." Another said, "I didn't think you had it in you, but damn, that was leadership." Vera stayed seated, still trying to process what had just happened. And maybe for the first time since she took over the HOA, she actually looked like she was listening, really listening. Whether it was the fear, the relief, or just the sheer weight of public reckoning, something had shifted in her. Jim Morrison stepped forward, looking both relieved and a little impressed himself. "Well," he said, adjusting his tie, "that might be the first auction I've ever seen end in a peace treaty." By noon, the crowd had thinned out, the tension had deflated, and something that looked a little like community had started to take root in the air. The same neighbors who used to nod politely at each other were now standing in circles, talking, laughing, sharing war stories, and planning for what came next. As for me, I walked out of the community center that day not as the guy who auctioned off Vera's house, but as the guy who turned a personal fight into a turning point for an entire neighborhood. Justice doesn't always have to come with sirens and court orders. Sometimes it looks like a signed lease, a resignation letter, and a room full of people realizing they don't have to live in fear anymore. And as I drove home, past my perfectly legal fence and the entrance sign that now had a future rent payment attached to it, I realized something. In Maple Grove, for the first time in years, respect had replaced fear. And that was the real win, the end of it. Maple Grove was almost unrecognizable in the best way possible. What started as a petty power struggle over a fence ended up triggering a full-blown reform of how our community governed itself. People who had once been afraid to speak up were now attending meetings, voicing opinions, and voting on policies that actually reflected the neighborhood's needs. The HOA transformed from a tool of control into something closer to what it was meant to be, a group of neighbors working with each other, not against each other. As for Vera, she kept her home, but true to our agreement, she stepped down as HOA president and stayed out of leadership positions. To her credit, she honored every term of our deal without delay or complaint. I even heard from a few neighbors that she'd started volunteering at the community garden, quietly helping out without trying to run the show. Maybe losing control was exactly what she needed to finally become a better neighbor. And me? I didn't become the villain or the hero exactly, but I did become the guy who proved that you can stand up for yourself without becoming the thing you're fighting. That sometimes the loudest statement you can make isn't vengeance, it's restraint. 6 weeks after that chaotic Saturday, I stood outside my house, looking at my perfectly legal fence and the land I had every right to protect. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace in my own neighborhood, because Maple Grove had finally learned the difference between control and leadership, and because I had to. By Thanksgiving, everything was officially resolved, and 6 months later, Maple Grove had undergone a transformation so complete it felt like a different world, only better. Property values had actually risen thanks to a new management system, rooted in transparency and fairness that drew in prospective homeowners like bees to honey. Real estate agents started marketing us as the fairest HOA in the entire county, and people began moving here not out of convenience, but because they wanted to be part of a community that respected individuality and reason. The days of fear-based compliance were over. No more neighbors walking on eggshells or avoiding eye contact out of fear they'd be reported for nonsense like mailbox color or lawn length. Instead of mandatory meetings filled with lectures and veiled threats, we had actual community events, barbecues, movie nights, volunteer days where people connected, laughed, and genuinely enjoyed being neighbors. Vera, to everyone's surprise, followed through on every promise. She stepped down as HOA president, co-authored the new guidelines, paid her share of the compensation without protest, and even seemed lighter, like someone finally free from the exhausting job of playing dictator. She started volunteering at the local animal shelter and, believe it or not, became a decent, even kind neighbor. These days, she tends her garden, and we wave to each other like civilized adults, something I never thought I'd see. One afternoon, as I passed by with the dogs, she looked up and said, "Thank you for showing me who I used to be." I never imagined I'd hear those words from her, but there they were. Now I sit on my porch, sipping coffee, looking at the same stone fence that sparked this entire roller coaster. It's still there, strong and elegant, right where it belongs on. My land and my horses graze peacefully beyond it. Neighbors wave as they stroll by, no longer afraid of arbitrary violations. And the fence, once labeled an unauthorized stone barrier, has quietly become a symbol of something bigger, a neighborhood reborn. And justice, finally, done right. People, now pointed out to visitors as the fence, the one that brought down a tyrant and sparked a transformation that made our neighborhood stronger, fairer, and more united than ever before. New residents often ask specifically about it when touring homes, eager to hear the full story of how one stone barrier became the unlikely symbol of accountability and change. What surprised me most about this whole saga was the lesson I never saw coming. Sometimes the people shouting the loudest are standing on the weakest ground. Vera's authority had never been real. It thrived only because people stayed silent, too tired, too intimidated, or too apathetic to push back. But once someone stood up, armed with facts instead of fear, her power crumbled like a house built on sand. And yes, I had every opportunity to destroy her completely, legally, publicly, and without mercy. But I realized that maybe real justice isn't about delivering the final blow. It's about holding your ground and then offering a path forward when it matters most. This whole experience reminded me that strength doesn't always come from domination. It often shows itself in restraint, in doing what's right instead of what's easy. If this story struck a chord with you, feel free to leave a comment or hit like. It truly makes a difference. And if you're interested in supporting future stories, that little thanks button is always there, no pressure. Thanks for writing this roller coaster all the way to the end. Stick around, because things only get crazier from here.